In this video, we're going to actually calculate the standard deviation. There's a couple of really important coding things to learn with regard to standard deviation, so this is also a pretty interesting lecture here. Before we do all that, before we look at code at all, though, let's look at just a little bit of math, the mathematics of equations. And we're going to start with the one we've been doing for quite a while now, the average. Here's the equation, here's the mathematical equation for the mean, or the average of an array. An array's A. And it's just the sum of over all n, in C, it's 0 to n minus 1, of A sub I, right? And then you divide that sum by n. The numerator of that equation, the sum of A sub I over all n, that's actually, there's code for that. We actually know the code for that. And here's the snippet of code that does that. Sum equals 0, the for loop, I equals 0, I less than n, I plus plus, sum equals sum plus A sub I. The key here in understanding the relationship between code and mathematical expressions is that whatever's inside that sigma term in the math thing goes at the end of that equation, sum equals sum plus whatever, right? In the simple case of the mean, it's just A sub I, A bracket I. Right? So let's look at a slightly more sophisticated equation, the standard deviation. First, the sample standard deviation. So first, I'm going to look at s squared, and then s is just the square root of that. Right? So if you look at the s squared term, you have another sigma. The sigma term is just the sum of A sub I minus the average value, minus the mean, all squared. So it's the sum of the squared difference between A sub I and the mean. That's how you say it in math terms. Two things to note. First thing is, before you calculate that sigma, you have to calculate the mean value. So in a computer program, there's going to be a section where you calculate the average, and then below that has to be the section where you calculate the standard deviation. You have to calculate the average first. The second thing is, when you look at the numerator of this s squared term, it's just a sum. Right? And so sum equals sum plus something, we're going to have to figure out what that something is. A sub I minus a bar squared. We're going to have to learn how to do the squared and the square root. So that's something also new that we're going to learn in this video. To get started, the program is going to be a lot like average underscore argv. So we go into our C code folder, and we take that folder, average underscore argv, and we make a copy of it. Let's change the name of it to stdev, standard deviation. I go in there, I get rid of the executable, and I change the name of average underscore argv.c to stdev.c. I double click on that, and it should come up in Xcode. This program, we're going to be doing math, the square root, power, stuff like that, and so it's something to squared. So we need a new header in addition to stdio.h and stdlib.h up there at the top above main. So I'm going to add the line hashtag include, and then the less than or greater than brackets math.h. Math.h has a lot of mathematical functions that computational scientists and people who do a lot of analytics and analysis use quite a bit. This is an important enough change. I think I'm going to add this to my template too. So sidebar, I'm going to go into the template folder, then I click on template.c. It'll come up in Xcode, and I'm going to add hashtag include math.h to that file as well. Save it, Command S, so that every time I bring up a new program from the template, it'll have math.h in it as well. Okay. So the only thing we have to do at the top is we just have to add a new variable, s, for sample standard deviation. And then calculating the average will be exactly the same, and we need to calculate the average first. Calculating the standard deviation is going to be very similar. I'm going to take that sum equals 0 and for loop. I'm going to highlight it and Command C it to copy it, then go down below the printf statement of where the average is printed and do a command V. I'm going to reuse sum, and I'm going to reuse the for loop, right? I'm going to reuse the I in the for loop, right? In that second for loop, the only difference is what comes after the plus. I need a sub I minus the average value squared. And to square something, you can just do it brute force. You can say a sub I minus average times, and then parentheses again, a sub I minus average. You could do it manually like that. But I'm going to use pow, the power command. And so I do sum equals sum plus, and then pow, then in parentheses, and then the first argument is also going to be in parentheses, a bracket I minus average. So pow, open parentheses, a bracket I minus average, close parentheses, comma. The first argument is what you're going to square. The second argument of pow is the power that you take it to. And in this case, we're squaring it, so it's 2.0. Then close parentheses, semicolon. Good. Once we're done with that for loop, we need to calculate the standard deviation S, and so we need to take the square root of that divided by n minus 1, and so square root is sqrt in math.h. So I say S equals sqrt. You could also use pow and just use 0.5. That also works, by the way. It's the same thing. But anyway, I'd say S equals sqrt, open parentheses, sum, the sum that we had, divided by, in parentheses, n minus 1. A word about n minus 1 versus n. N minus 1 is the sample standard deviation, and n is the population standard deviation. There's subtle statistical differences. Of course, with all statistical calculations, there's nuance, and so I'm just trying to teach code here, not become a statistician or anything like that. Excel uses the sample standard deviation too for small data sets, and so but I'm going to compare, when I compare my answer to Excel, I want to use that equation, n minus 1, not n. But of course, if you need the n equation, you just change that in the code. That's no problem. Okay, so that's it. Oh, and then you need a printf statement. You need to print out that the sample standard deviation is equal to %f backslash n, then comma s, and then close parentheses, semicolon. Okay, that's it. I command S that. I go into my terminal, I double click on the terminal, cd desktop, cd code, cd stdev. I compile it, and then I'm going to run it with o10.txt. So I go st./stdev space o10.txt, and up comes the standard deviation. And I checked it on Excel, and it's the same value of standard deviation, so it worked. That's it. That's the program. What did we learn? Wow, we learned about math.h, and there's all these mathematical functions that we can have. We learned about the order, right? We learned that, you know, if you're going to do something, if you see the average in an equation, you need to calculate that before you do calculate the sum of the square differences for standard deviation, right? So I did the for loop for the average, then below calculating the average, I did the for loop for sum, for the standard deviation. Learn that. And then the other thing that we learned, which is also interesting, is that in math, we learned the relationship between math and code. So sigma, which is this complicated statistical looking thing, oh my gosh, it's scary. No, it's just a for loop, right? So the only difference between all different sigmas is what's inside the sigma goes at the end of sum equals sum plus that. So in code, it goes there. In the equation, it's inside the sigma. That's it. So now I could give you some daunting thing like the standard deviation or some other complicated calculation with a bunch of sigmas in it. Turns out it's pretty easy. You just have to put in whatever sum equals sum plus that, and then that thing inside there. It's really, we learned a lot in this video.